Monday morning. I did not bring the resignation letter everyone expected. I brought a workload analysis, midnight login logs, and a meeting schedule ready to dismantle the board's optimization fairy tale. By 10:17, the chief financial officer stopped speaking, internal counsel froze, and the boss who told me, "You should be grateful you were not fired," realized some people cannot be sacrificed. I did not scream. I forced every email, number, and lie to stand against its creator. My name is Ella Crawford. I am 32 years old, and I am the Senior Service Operations Manager at Halcyon Road Systems. We are headquartered in a sleek, aggressively modern glass building in downtown Denver. If you were to read our press releases or scroll through our corporate social media pages, you would think we are the absolute pinnacle of modern workplace culture. We sell complex operational management software, and our public image is built entirely on trendy buzzwords like flexible workflows, synergy, and people-centric design. We have the requisite ping-pong tables in the break room that no one is ever allowed to actually use because everyone is terrified of missing a deadline. We have refrigerators stocked with expensive sparkling water and walls painted in calming, neutral tones. But underneath that shiny, carefully curated exterior, Halcyon is a relentless pressure cooker. It is an organization pathologically obsessed with quarter-over-quarter growth and the desperate manufacturing of perfectly manicured reporting metrics to appease our investors. The truth of the matter is that we are all running a never-ending marathon on a broken treadmill, and the only real rule in this company is that you cannot ever let the board of directors see you sweat. This Friday morning started with the unmistakable low-level hum of corporate panic. The air conditioning in the building felt at least 5 degrees colder than usual, a subtle physical warning of the slaughter that was about to take place. Grant Mercer, who had just been hastily and aggressively promoted to the role of Chief Operating Officer, summoned me via an automated calendar invite sent exactly 3 minutes before the meeting was supposed to begin. He chose the smallest, most suffocating, and isolated glass conference room on the 4th floor executive wing. When I walked in, he did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how my morning was going. He simply took a printed spreadsheet and slid it across the faux oak table toward me. It was the master department roster, and a full 30% of the names on that list were highlighted in a sickening, bright, neon yellow marker. It was a bloodbath, neatly organized into perfectly formatted rows and columns. Grant leaned forward in his ergonomic chair, resting his tailored sleeves on the table. "Marisol Vega, Owen Pike, and Lydia Hart," he said, tapping a manicured finger against the paper. His voice was completely flat and devoid of any human emotion, as if he were simply reading a grocery list instead of ending people's livelihoods. I stared at those 3 names, feeling the solid floor drop out from under my feet. Those were not just random employees. They were the absolute load-bearing pillars of my entire operation. Marisol was the undisputed master of our strategic accounts, handling the massive corporate clients who paid us millions of dollars a year. She knew their kids' names, she knew their operational quirks, and she was the only reason they renewed their contracts. Owen was our lone engineering savant who handled the most critical system incidents. He was the guy who kept our back-end servers from completely melting down at 2 o'clock in the morning without ever complaining, and Lydia was our immovable firewall. She was the compliance reporting expert who meticulously documented every process to ensure we did not violate our massive, highly regulated federal contracts. They were the 3 most vital gears in the entire operational engine of my department. "We are executing a strategic workforce optimization," Grant continued smoothly, using the exact sanitized corporate language designed to distance leadership from the reality of ruining people's lives. "I need you to temporarily absorb all of their duties." He looked at me with dead eyes. He did not blink. He was asking me to take on the highly specialized work of 3 entirely different departments, a request so utterly detached from reality that I momentarily thought I had misunderstood his words. I gripped the cold edge of the conference table. "Grant, you cannot possibly call this a simple resource reallocation," I said, forcing my voice to stay low and steady despite the blind panic rising rapidly in my throat. You are forcing one single person to do the work of 3 entire departments piled on top of each other. My original job role still exists, and that alone already takes up 60 hours of my week. Marisol personally manages our 20 biggest, most demanding contracts. Owen is essentially on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to fix critical bugs. Lydia's audit reports require days of forensic data gathering just to draft a single summary. It is not just difficult to absorb this. It is physically and mathematically impossible, Grant sighed loudly, performing a highly dramatic display of executive impatience. He adjusted his heavy, expensive watch and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. Honestly, Ella, you should consider yourself lucky you still have a seat at this table. The economy is incredibly tight right now. We all have to step up and do more with less. The sheer audacity of the statement made my blood run entirely cold. It was the ultimate corporate gaslighting technique, framing an impossible burden as some sort of generous gift. He stood up abruptly, towering over the small table and buttoning his suit jacket to signal that the conversation was entirely over. The board of directors needs to see that this department can maintain perfectly smooth operations after these necessary cuts. We have to show absolute resilience. I want a comprehensive, detailed transition plan sitting on my desk by 9 o'clock Monday morning. Figure it out. He walked out of the glass room, leaving me sitting alone, staring at the bright yellow streaks of ink that represented the sudden end of 3 careers and the intentional, calculated sabotage of my own. Stepping out of that glass box and back into the main floor felt like walking onto the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. The usually chaotic, noisy open-plan office was now dead silent. There was no casual chatter, no ringing desk phones, no rapid clicking of keyboards. I saw empty desks that had been occupied by my friends just an hour ago. Brown cardboard boxes sat haphazardly on chairs, hastily packed with dying desk succulents, coffee mugs, and framed photos of families. I glanced at the monitors of the few pale survivors who remained. Their Slack applications were filled with gray text reading that a message had been deleted. Digital ghosts of colleagues whose corporate accounts had been instantly wiped from the main servers. The people who were spared stared blankly at their screens, their shoulders hunched, completely terrified that making eye contact with anyone might somehow draw attention back toward them. I kept my head down and walked numbly toward the break room, desperately needing a glass of water to clear the dry, metallic taste of panic in my mouth. As I passed the large printing station in the hallway, a senior data analyst from the finance team walked past me in the opposite direction. He was carrying a stack of papers and looking straight ahead. He did not break his stride, and his face remained entirely neutral. But as he brushed past my shoulder, he dropped a hurried, whispered sentence into the quiet air. "Do not delete the old audit folders." He kept walking rapidly, disappearing around the corner before I could even turn my head to look at him. I stopped dead in my tracks in the middle of the hallway. That tiny, rushed, cryptic sentence hit me harder than Grant's entire scripted speech. Why would anyone care about dusty, outdated audit folders on a day of mass layoffs? The fear swirling in my stomach suddenly began to crystallize into a sharp, freezing focus. That night, long after the sun had set, I sat alone in my car in the desolate Halcyon parking lot. The freezing Denver wind howled against the glass windows, but the interior of my car felt utterly, suffocatingly still. I gripped the leather steering wheel, staring up at the brightly lit executive floor where Grant was likely drinking expensive scotch and congratulating himself on a highly successful corporate optimization. I am not a flawless superhero from a movie. I am a deeply exhausted 32-year-old woman with a terrifying mountain of student debt, a brand new lease on a very expensive city apartment, and absolutely zero financial padding to just angrily quit my job in a fiery blaze of glory. I needed this paycheck, but sitting there in the dark, connecting the dots of the day, I finally understood the truth. This was no longer just a classic, depressing American corporate story about a middle manager being casually crushed under impossible expectations. Grant Mercer was a numbers guy, a man obsessed with optics over reality. He knew exactly what he was doing. You do not abruptly fire the specific people holding the most critical parts of the system together right before a major board review simply to save a few dollars on the payroll. You fire them to hide the glaring fact that the system is already completely broken. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone capable enough to frantically keep the lights on for a few weeks, but overwhelmed enough to inevitably drop the ball when the time was right to assign blame. This was the exact, defining moment where my path split. I could lower my head, push myself to work 100 hours a week, drain myself completely, and still end up being dismissed for incompetence when the company inevitably failed its upcoming compliance reviews and the major clients walked away. Or, I could use this weekend. I could tear apart every piece of data, every hidden system log, and every old audit folder they thought was permanently buried. I turned the key in the ignition, the car engine roaring to life in the quiet, frozen night. I was not going to be the silent sacrifice for their ridiculous efficiency charade. I was going to force every single lie to stand up and face the light. I am not the kind of person who can flip a desk and storm out to the sound of slow clapping. I am deeply pragmatic, perpetually exhausted, and tethered to the crushing reality of $82,000 in student loan debt. Just last month, I signed a 12-month lease on a one-bedroom apartment in the Highlands neighborhood that costs $2,400 a month. I do not have the financial runway to act on principle alone. Principles do not pay the heating bill in the middle of a Colorado winter, nor do they cover the rising cost of groceries. I live in the real world, a place where sudden unemployment means a rapid, terrifying slide into complete financial ruin. Over my 4 years at Halcyon Route Systems, I had become the invisible glue holding the cracking foundation together. I did not possess a glossy executive title. My business cards did not command immediate respect at high-end networking events, yet I was the single person everyone desperately searched for when things inevitably caught fire. If a client dashboard displayed catastrophic data errors, I fixed it. If an enterprise account made an entirely unreasonable demand that threatened to break our service agreements, I smoothed it over. If the finance team needed a patched-up operational report 30 minutes before submitting it to our corporate lenders, my phone was the one that rang. Because of this constant, exhausting firefighting, I knew the ugliest, most heavily guarded secret that the executive team completely refused to acknowledge. Halcyon did not run on the proprietary artificial intelligence workflows they heavily marketed to Silicon Valley venture capitalists. They sold a highly lucrative lie of seamless automation. In reality, the company ran entirely on the backs of exhausted human beings who silently compensated for gaping software holes by working endless hours of unpaid overtime. When the automated routing failed, my team manually sorted the data at 3 a.m. We were the manual overrides for a system sold as autonomous, human bandages covering deep structural wounds. Grant Mercer had absolutely no business running an operations department. He was not a logistics expert, and he certainly was not an engineering prodigy. His entire professional background was in sales strategy. He was a man who knew exactly how to stand in front of a venture capital board, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, and spin a spectacular, hypnotic story about synergy and market capture. He was significantly better at designing a sleek slide presentation than he was at fixing a desperately broken deployment process. His entire career was built on aggressively promising the moon and leaving the actual engineers to figure out how to build the rocket overnight. 3 months ago, a massive, highly anticipated acquisition deal had completely fallen apart behind closed doors. The executive team never publicly announced the failure to the company at large, but the internal temperature shifted immediately. The casual Friday lunches vanished. The budget for basic office supplies was suddenly scrutinized. Grant became visibly obsessed with crafting a brand new narrative to appease the restless board of directors. He needed to prove that Halcyon could operate with fewer people, generate significantly higher profit margins, and keep the engine running flawlessly. He needed a miracle, or he needed a very convincing illusion. Sitting at my small kitchen island that Friday night, staring at the blank screen of my personal laptop, the scattered pieces of the afternoon's puzzle violently snapped together. Grant had not just thrown darts at a roster. Marisol, Owen, and Lydia were not random casualties of a blind budget cut. They were surgically removed. They were the three exact people who held the actual, unfiltered data. They understood the crushing reality of our true workload better than anyone else in the building. More importantly, they were the absolute hardest people to bully into signing off on fabricated, rosy status reports. Lydia would rather swallow broken glass than falsify a federal compliance document. She knew the severe legal penalties of misrepresenting audit data. Owen refused to close an engineering ticket until the root cause was actually solved, completely ignoring management's relentless pleas to just apply a temporary patch to make the numbers look good. Marisol would never lie to her enterprise clients about a service delay, just to make the quarterly metrics look slightly better for a board meeting. They were the fierce truth-tellers in a department increasingly desperate to hide the truth. I closed my eyes and mentally scrolled through the emails Grant had sent over the last 4 weeks. The pattern was blindingly obvious now, glowing like a neon warning sign in the dark. He had constantly demanded that managers simplify our severity codes. He explicitly instructed us not to escalate any issue unless it was an absolute, literal fire that the client was loudly complaining about. He repeatedly typed the phrase, "Prioritize the optics first." In multiple company-wide memos, he was meticulously laying the groundwork to hide the smoke before the entire building burned down. He wanted the system to look perfect on paper, regardless of how badly it was failing in reality. That night, instead of drafting a furious resignation letter, I walked over to my coffee maker. I brewed a massive pot of dark roast coffee, filling my largest mug to the brim, and carried it back to my dining table. I opened my personal laptop and logged into the back-end reporting portal through our secure virtual private network. I ignored the primary executive dashboards that Grant loved to show off. Instead, I started pulling raw data from the deep, forgotten operational reports that nobody in the executive suite ever bothered to read closely. I pulled server logs, client communication histories, and raw compliance audit trails. As the thousands of rows of raw data began to populate on my screen, a cold, terrifying clarity washed over me. I finally understood the absolute worst-case scenario, and it was significantly more dangerous than simply being overworked or suddenly laid off. Grant was not just being greedy, he was building a highly calculated trap. If I foolishly accepted his mandate to absorb the jobs of 3 entirely different departments, the system would inevitably collapse under the impossible weight. It was a mathematical certainty. One person cannot perform 120 hours of highly technical work in a standard 40-hour workweek. And when the servers inevitably crashed, when the massive clients breached their contracts and walked away in fury, and when the federal compliance audits failed spectacularly, Grant would not take the blame. He would simply open a pristine file folder, point directly at my name on the organizational chart, and tell the board of directors that the new senior service operations manager was simply incompetent. He would heavily document that I completely failed to maintain the post-restructure stability. I would be framed as the sole reason his grand optimization strategy failed. I would not just lose my job. I would become the official, legally documented scapegoat for the destruction of a multi-million-dollar software company. My professional reputation in the Denver tech industry would be permanently ruined, heavily tied to a catastrophic operational failure that I had absolutely no power to prevent. I took a slow sip of the scalding black coffee, staring at the blue light of the screen. I was not going to let a glorified salesman use my career as a human shield. Saturday morning arrived without the usual relief of the weekend. I woke up long before the sun rose over the mountains, my mind completely consumed by the sheer impossibility of the tasks laid out before me. I made my way to the small desk in the corner of my living room and opened my laptop. The silence of my apartment stood in stark contrast to the loud, chaotic racing of my thoughts. I logged into the company network, completely bypassing the polished, high-level dashboards designed for executive viewing. I needed the raw, unedited truth. I began meticulously exporting the raw support ticket data, the complex incident resolution logs, the scheduled client call blocks, the strict compliance reporting cycles, and the average handle times for every single category over the past 90 days. The system hummed, slowly spitting out thousands of rows of unfiltered reality. I opened a fresh, blank spreadsheet. I stripped away all the corporate branding and focused entirely on the cold, hard mathematics of my new reality. I carefully assigned the historical time averages to the massive pile of duties Grant had so casually dumped onto my lap just 24 hours earlier. I calculated the absolute bare minimum time required to execute these duties without explicitly violating our rigid service level agreements. When I finally hit the enter key on the total sum, the resulting number made the breath catch in my throat. 86 hours. If I worked with absolute machine-like perfection, taking 0 breaks for meals, dealing with absolutely 0 unexpected server crashes or client escalations, it would take me 86 hours a week just to keep the department barely afloat. It was not a stretch goal. It was a mathematical impossibility, an intentional setup for inevitable failure. While reviewing the operational modules I now needed to integrate into my daily workflow, I decided to cross-reference my own system access permissions. I needed to ensure I actually had the technical clearance to view the old compliance queues. That was when I found the first real piece of the trap. Deep inside the secure portal reserved for lender diligence, 2 highly sensitive readiness confirmation documents were sitting proudly in the completed folder. These specific documents legally certified to our external financial backers that our department possessed the necessary structural integrity and workforce capacity to handle a massive influx of new capital following the restructuring. I scrolled down to the electronic signature line at the bottom of the page. My name was permanently stamped there as the final, authorizing approver. A cold chill radiated down my spine. I had never seen these documents in my entire life. I had certainly never reviewed their contents, and I absolutely did not sign them. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I immediately pulled up the underlying metadata properties for both digital files. The truth was hidden right there in the digital footprint. They were not signed from my assigned office workstation or my home internet protocol address. They were authorized and time-stamped at exactly 12:43 and 1:12 in the morning. Furthermore, the network address attached to the digital signature belonged exclusively to the executive virtual private network. Someone in the highest tier of leadership had logged in and used my credentials in the middle of the night to falsely certify a clean bill of health. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs as I dug directly into my own user profile logs. I needed to know how this was even technically possible. The answer was waiting in the administrative security audit trail. Someone had quietly expanded my system privileges exactly 1 week ago. They had silently granted my account the specific, high-level security clearance required to self-approve severe financial diligence reports. It was an incredibly convenient change. It was the perfect, flawless setup. When the external auditors eventually sifted through the wreckage and found the fraudulent documents, the entire digital paper trail would point directly to a rogue, overwhelmed middle manager approving her own false reports to hide her department's failures. My mind violently snapped back to the hurried, whispered warning I had received in the hallway the day before regarding the old audit folders. I immediately navigated away from the active servers and dug into the shared archive drive. This was essentially a digital graveyard where outdated files, rough drafts, and abandoned projects went to collect digital dust. I bypassed the clean, finalized versions of the quarterly reports that were presented to the board. Instead, I opened the hidden, unrestricted subfolders containing the raw, unedited drafts and the track changes documents. What I found inside those folders was a comprehensive, meticulously documented treasure trove of corporate fraud. Over the past 6 months, multiple severe service-level agreement violations had occurred on our platform. There were massive system outages that lasted for several hours, and data routing failures that cost our enterprise clients thousands of dollars in lost revenue. According to the strict terms of our legal contracts, Halcyon was obligated to pay heavy financial penalties for every single one of these technical failures. But as I read through the draft folders, I watched the truth get systematically erased and rewritten. The internal incident tags had been manually edited by management before the final reports were generated. A catastrophic event initially labeled as a critical outage was backspaced out and smoothly replaced with the phrase enhancement delay. A severe back-end server failure was magically transformed into a scheduled maintenance extension. They were blatantly altering the recorded history of our operational failures. They were doing this specifically to avoid paying the mandatory contractual penalties, completely defrauding our biggest clients and falsely inflating the company's profitability metrics right before a major refinancing push. I cross-referenced the specific clients who were actively affected by these fabricated enhancement delays. The names on the screen matched perfectly. They were the exact enterprise accounts managed exclusively by Marisol. The complex systems that repeatedly failed were the exact back-end structures Owen maintained and documented. The regulatory compliance loopholes used to hide these lies were the exact legal standards Lydia vigorously policed. The sickening reality of Friday morning finally made total, terrifying sense. Grant had not just fired 3 expensive employees to save money. He had permanently and intentionally silenced the absolute last 3 people who retained the actual, factual, institutional knowledge about our binding commitments. The company had just severed the exact lifelines that the enterprise contracts depended on. Sitting there in the pale morning light, the entire nature of my situation violently shifted. The heavy, depressing exhaustion of being just another overworked corporate employee completely evaporated from my body. It was instantly replaced by the razor-sharp, freezing adrenaline of pure survival. I was no longer a victim trying to figure out how to navigate a toxic work environment or handle a terrible boss. I was a professional whose name, reputation, and digital identity had just been hijacked and weaponized. I was being unknowingly tied to a massive chain of financial and operational fraud. This was a ticking time bomb of legal liability. It could explode at any given moment, and when the federal regulators or the corporate lawyers finally came looking for blood, Grant had perfectly positioned me to take the entire blast. I closed the archive folders, my hands shaking slightly, and securely backed up the raw metadata, the forged signatures, and the altered drafts to my own encrypted external drive. I knew exactly what I had to do. If I simply walked away now, if I quietly handed in my resignation on Monday morning and disappeared into the job market, they would still possess my forged signatures. They would still hold the altered logs. I would leave as a burned-out, incapable manager who could not handle the pressure, and they would quietly pin the inevitable collapse of the company directly on my sudden, cowardly departure. I made a silent vow to myself right then and there. I was going to leave Halcyon, but I was absolutely not going to leave as a drained, exploited scapegoat. I was going to leave only after I dragged every single piece of this fraudulent, rotting structure into the blinding light of day, armed with undeniable hard data that no executive could ever lie their way out of. I spent the entirety of Saturday anchored to my dining table, ignoring the bright weekend sun outside my window. Instead of resting, I was swimming through the dense, aggressively boring legal jargon of our master service agreements. These were the binding contracts for the massive strategic clients that Marisol used to manage. Most people at Halcyon never actually read these documents past the pricing tier summary. Grant certainly never read them. He considered legal paperwork to be the administrative friction that slowed down his visionary sales momentum. That arrogance was exactly what I was counting on. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my eyes burning from the screen, I found the fatal flaw in his grand optimization strategy. It was buried deep in Section 4, Paragraph 7 of the agreements for our top 3 enterprise accounts. The clause was crystal clear. It stated that replacing any key personnel required formal, written notification to the client within 24 hours. Failure to provide this notice constituted a material staffing change and immediately triggered the client's right to demand a formal cure plan, or worse, their right to terminate the contract without penalty. Grant had fired Marisol on Friday morning. By Monday morning, the 24-hour window would officially close, and Halcyon would be an active, undeniable breach of its most lucrative contracts. My next move was to check the shared corporate calendar for the upcoming week. I needed to understand exactly how the executive team planned to navigate the fallout. I found a blocked-out, high-level meeting scheduled for late Monday morning. The attendee list included the board of directors, the chief financial officer, and the external representatives for our upcoming refinancing round. The stated agenda was a formal executive confirmation that our service delivery was not materially impacted by the recent workforce reduction. Grant was planning to walk into that room, look the investors directly in the eye, and swear that everything was perfectly fine, entirely unaware that the company was already bleeding out from the contracts he just violated. I opened a new, blank document. I did not write an angry manifesto. I did not use a single emotional adjective. I spent the next several hours meticulously building two entirely separate arsenals. The first was a workload matrix. It was a cold, hyper-professional, and completely objective spreadsheet. It laid out the exact operational requirements of the newly combined roles, mapping them directly against the mandatory service level agreements. It proved, purely through undeniable mathematics, that the new expectations were fundamentally impossible to meet without causing catastrophic service failures. The second document was far more dangerous. It was a formal, legally protected whistleblower memo addressed directly to the Halcyon Audit Committee. This memo did not complain about unfair treatment or toxic culture. It focused strictly on the hard facts. It listed the exact timestamps of the unauthorized access to my account. It named the specific compliance reports that were falsely approved. It detailed the immediate legal risks of the master service agreement breaches that were about to activate. Sitting in the quiet of my living room, I stared at the two completed files on my desktop. I did not view any of this as a petty act of corporate revenge. Revenge implies an emotional desire to hurt someone simply because they hurt you. This was not about hurting Grant. In my mind, it felt like an absolutely necessary act of self-preservation. I was carefully loosening the ties around myself before they could bind me forever to a ship that was sinking fast. With the documents finalized, I moved on to tactical logistics. I opened my Outlook calendar and began rearranging my schedule for Monday morning in a way that was entirely valid, completely compliant with standard operating procedure, but extremely calculated. Grant had scheduled an internal department sync for 8:30 in the morning to review my transition plan. I immediately moved my standing weekly status call with Marisol's largest, most demanding client to 9:15. I placed the external reality check right up against the internal fantasy. I wanted to create a scenario where every single lie Grant planned to tell during our internal meeting would be instantly, brutally exposed by the cold reality of the client call less than an hour later. He would not have the time or the space to spin a new narrative. The collision between his fabricated optimization and the client's contractual demands would happen in real time, right in the middle of the office. As evening fell, I picked up my personal cell phone. I bypassed our company messaging application entirely and opened a secure encrypted text thread. I added Marisol, Owen, and Lydia to the group. I knew they were likely spending their weekend updating their resumes and processing the shock of the sudden termination. I typed out a brief, careful message. I'm going to stir things up considerably on Monday morning. I cannot promise any kind of victory, and I cannot promise this will fix anything, but I need you all to do one thing for me right now. Lock down your personal archives. Save every single message, email, or Slack screenshot you have where Grant or anyone else requested you to perform out-of-scope work. Ignore a severity code, or backdate any compliance document. Keep them ready. Marisol was the first to reply. A single thumbs-up reaction. Owen responded a few minutes later with a simple, "Done." Lydia, always the meticulous auditor, replied, "I already backed up my entire communication history to a hard drive the second I saw the meeting invite on Friday. Go get them." Sunday night arrived with a heavy, quiet stillness across the city. The weekend was over, and the impending reality of Monday loomed large. I did not spend my final free hours watching television or trying to relax. I connected my laptop to my small home printer. The machine hummed and clicked, slowly churning out page after page of the workload matrix, the system logs, and the protected whistleblower memo. I watched the warm pages fall into the tray, I gathered them up, double-checked the page numbers, and slid them into crisp, thick manila envelopes. I sealed each one carefully, writing the intended recipient's title in neat, block letters across the front. I did not print these documents out of some dramatic, theatrical desire to slam papers onto a desk. I printed them because I understood the psychology of a corporate crisis. In the digital age, an email can be easily deleted, accidentally routed to a spam folder, or conveniently ignored by a panicked executive claiming they never saw it. A digital file is an abstract concept until it is inconvenient. But physical paper is entirely different. When you hand a thick, heavy stack of printed evidence directly to a human resources director or a chief financial officer, it becomes an undeniable physical object in the room. It demands immediate acknowledgement. Paper and ink carry weight. In the exact moment of decision, when the executives are desperately trying to talk their way out of a corner, the undeniable permanence of black ink on white paper is significantly stronger than 100 verbal arguments. I placed the sealed envelopes into my leather work bag and set it directly by the front door. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the streetlights glowing in the cold Denver air. The nervous, suffocating anxiety that had plagued me all day Friday was completely gone. It had burned away, leaving behind a cold, solid resolve. I realized in that quiet moment that I was no longer afraid of Grant Mercer. I was no longer afraid of being labeled as difficult, uncooperative, or completely ungrateful by the management team. I did not care if I was disliked. The only thing in the world that I truly feared at that point was remaining quiet for just a moment too long, giving someone else the opportunity to permanently write my professional obituary. They had tried to turn me into a compliant victim. Tomorrow morning, they were going to find out exactly what happens when the scapegoat decides to lock the doors and force the whole scheme into the open. I arrived at the office at 8 o'clock in the morning, finding my desk exactly as I had left it on Friday afternoon. The open floor plan was uncomfortably quiet, a lingering hangover from the brutal workforce reduction. People were typing softly, avoiding eye contact, and attempting to shrink into their ergonomic chairs. I did not shrink. I unpacked my bag, arranged my printed files, and waited for the clock on my monitor to tick forward. At exactly 8:55 in the morning, I opened a new email draft. I attached the workload matrix I had meticulously built over the weekend. I addressed the email to Grant Mercer, but I did not stop there. Following the strict, documented protocol for transitional planning, I added Dana Heller, the chief financial officer. I copied the designated human resources business partner. Finally, I added the group inbox for legal operations. The body of the email contained absolutely zero emotional language. There were no pleas for help, no complaints about fairness, and no expressions of exhaustion. It was a sterile, irrefutable mathematical proof demonstrating that the newly assigned workload could not be executed by one person without severely violating our contractual service commitments and internal compliance controls. I hit send and immediately stood up, grabbing my notebook to head toward the main conference area for the morning briefing. The morning sync was held in the large glass-walled boardroom right in the center of the office. Everyone could see us. Grant marched into the room 3 minutes late. His face flushed a deep, angry shade of red. He had clearly just read his emails. Dana Heller sat at the far end of the long table, her posture rigid, her eyes darting between her laptop screen and Grant. The human resources partner sat rigidly next to her. Grant threw his notebook onto the center of the table. He decided to play offense, attempting to publicly frame my data as an act of insubordination. He looked around the room, making sure the few remaining team members outside the glass could see him taking charge. "I have to say, Ella, I am incredibly disappointed," Grant began, his voice dripping with loud, manufactured condescension. "We are going through a critical transition phase. This company needs team players. Sending out a spreadsheet listing all the reasons you cannot do your job shows a highly concerning anti-change attitude. Top performers adapt when the company faces headwinds. They do not hide behind math to avoid rolling up their sleeves." He was trying to bait me into a defensive, emotional argument. He wanted me to raise my voice or complain about being stressed so he could easily write me off as hysterical and uncooperative. I did not take the bait. I sat up straight, folded my hands on the table, and looked him directly in the eyes. "Grant, I am not discussing my attitude or my willingness to work," I stated evenly, making sure my voice carried clearly to Dana Heller at the end of the table. "I am simply asking for explicit clarification on your operational directive. Are you asking me to take personal responsibility and sign formal readiness confirmations for operational pipelines that no longer have the required personnel to legally function?" The entire room froze. The subtle hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roaring jet engine. Dana Heller stopped typing. Her head snapped up, her sharp eyes locking onto Grant. Grant realized immediately that he was cornered in front of the chief financial officer. His confident facade cracked, giving way to defensive irritation. He waved his hand dismissively, a frantic gesture to brush away the massive liability I had just dropped onto the table. "You need to do whatever it takes to maintain stability," he snapped, his voice losing its polished executive tone. "Just get it done, Ella. And make sure you update the weekend transition notes to reflect that the system stability has been fully assessed and secured." It was the exact catastrophic error I needed him to make on the record. He had just verbally instructed me to falsify a risk assessment in front of a room full of witnesses. "I understand your request," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and completely flat. "However, I cannot backdate any operational assessment or confirm system stability when the current data clearly indicates an active, immediate risk of violating our service level agreements." Nobody spoke. The heavy silence was a physical weight pressing down on the polished wood table. Grant opened his mouth to shout, but before he could form a word, the digital clock on the wall flipped to 9:15. The speakerphone in the center of the table beeped loudly, signaling the start of the scheduled conference call with our largest enterprise client. Grant scrambled to recover, desperately trying to switch back into his smooth, charismatic sales persona. He reached forward and pressed the flashing green button to answer the call. "Good morning. This is Grant Mercer," he said, forcing a bright, artificial cheerfulness into his voice. "We have Ella Crawford on the line as well." The voice of the client representative echoed through the room. It was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Good morning. I am looking over the invite list. Where is Marisol? She is usually the one leading these weekly syncs, and she has not responded to my weekend emails regarding the upcoming deployment schedule." Grant leaned toward the microphone, smiling a tight, nervous smile that the client could not see. Yes. Marisol is no longer on this specific account. It is simply a minor internal reshuffle to streamline our communication. Ella will be absorbing her duties moving forward to ensure you get even faster service." He lied effortlessly, assuming the client would accept the corporate jargon and move on. He assumed I would sit silently and play along with the charade. He assumed completely wrong. I reached out and pulled my printed copy of the Master Service Agreement closer to me. I leaned into the microphone. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the lingering echo of Grant's lie, "according to Section 4, Paragraph 7 of your Master Service Agreement regarding named personnel changes, any transition of key account management requires a formal, written notification within 24 hours of the change." I paused, letting the heavy legal terminology sink into the receiver. I looked directly at Grant, who was staring at me with wide, completely horrified eyes. "I want to ensure we are maintaining full transparency with your team." I continued smoothly into the speaker. "You absolutely have the right to receive that official notification, and I want to confirm for your records that Halcyon has not yet sent it." The silence from the speakerphone was deafening. It was the sound of a multi-million-dollar contract suddenly halting in its tracks. "I see," the client representative finally responded, his tone turning to absolute ice. "A minor internal reshuffle does not accurately describe the unannounced removal of our primary strategic lead. We take our contractual notification rights very seriously. I will be escalating this to our legal department immediately to discuss our options regarding this sudden material change." The call disconnected with a sharp, final click. The air in the glass conference room was completely dead. Grant was paralyzed in his chair, his jaw slightly open, the remaining color draining rapidly from his face. He had tried to play a dangerous game of optics, and I had just detonated reality right in the middle of his carefully constructed stage. I slowly turned my head away from the phone and looked down the long table. Dana Heller was no longer looking at her laptop. She was staring directly at Grant. The expression on her face was chilling. She was not looking at a fellow executive. She was not looking at a trusted colleague or an ally in the boardroom. She was looking at a massive, walking liability who had just actively triggered a critical breach of contract with their biggest source of revenue right in front of her. The chief financial officer finally understood that the optimization story was a complete fabrication, and she realized, with absolute clarity, that she was sitting entirely too close to a man who had just set the entire building on fire. The dead air in the glass boardroom lasted for exactly 3 seconds before Grant abruptly stood up. His heavy chair scraped violently against the polished floor, the sound echoing sharply across the silent room. He did not look at the chief financial officer. He did not acknowledge the human resources partner. He marched directly toward me, his face tight with a furious, panicked energy that he was desperately trying to contain. "My office, right now," he hissed, his voice dropping an entire octave to maintain some fragile semblance of executive control in front of the watching floor. I calmly gathered my notebook and my leather bag, matching his frantic, vibrating anger with absolute, glacial stillness. I followed him out of the glass box and down the narrow, carpeted hallway toward his corner suite. The moment I crossed the threshold of his office, he slammed the heavy, solid wood door shut, completely cutting us off from the open floor. The blinds were partially drawn, casting long, sharp shadows across his pristine, aggressively organized desk. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Grant demanded. He did not bother to sit down. He paced rapidly behind his desk, eventually leaning forward to plant both of his hands firmly on the dark wood surface. He was trying to use his physical height to intimidate me, looming over the space between us. "You just intentionally sabotaged a multi-million-dollar account. You threw a live grenade into a critical client meeting simply because you are throwing a childish tantrum over a temporary workload increase. I could terminate your employment right this exact second for gross misconduct and deliberate destruction of business operations. Do you understand the severity of what you just did? You are entirely replaceable." I did not blink. I did not step back. I did not offer a frantic apology, nor did I attempt to passionately defend my loyalty to the company. I simply reached into my bag, unclasped the brass lock, and pulled out one of the crisp manila envelopes I had prepared the night before. I opened it and slowly slid 2 pieces of printed paper across the polished wood of his desk. "I am not here to discuss my workload anymore, Grant," I said. My voice was completely flat, barely above a whisper, yet it carried the undeniable, heavy weight of a judge reading a final sentence. "I am here to discuss these." Grant glared at me for a split second before dropping his gaze to the papers. His eyes scanned the highlighted rows of raw data. They were the hard copies of the system metadata. The timestamps clearly read 12:43 in the morning and 1:12 in the morning. The network address prominently displayed at the top of the logs belonged exclusively to the Executive Virtual Private Network. The document titles were the exact readiness confirmations required for the upcoming lender diligence review, and the final, authorizing digital signature line bore my exact name. The furious, flushed red color drained from Grant's face in an instant, rapidly replaced by a sickly pale gray. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. When he finally spoke again, the screaming, aggressive intimidation was entirely gone. It was instantly replaced by the slick, oily tone of a desperate salesman trying to downplay a fatal structural flaw in a product. "This is absolutely nothing," he said, waving a hand dismissively over the papers, though I noticed his fingers were trembling slightly. "This is just standard administrative completion." The executive operations team handled the final system sign-off to ensure we met the strict external filing deadlines. It is a completely normal, helpful procedure when our mid-level managers are overwhelmed with their daily tasks. We were just streamlining the process for you. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of framing criminal identity theft and federal compliance fraud as a helpful corporate favor was staggering. I looked at him with absolute, unshielded disgust. You used my secure digital identity to forge legal risk assessments that deliberately hide your structural failures from our financial backers, I stated cleanly, leaving absolutely no room for his corporate spin to take root. And you did it right before attempting to force me out of the company to take the blame. He opened his mouth, likely to spin another desperate lie, but I cut him off with a single, softly spoken sentence that completely destroyed his remaining initiative. I already preserved the server logs. Grant froze entirely. His breath hitched, before his panicked brain could fully process the fact that I had completely trapped him. The heavy wooden door of his office clicked open. We both turned our heads. Standing in the doorway was Reese Calder. Reese was a mid-level systems security specialist. He was the kind of guy who wore plain gray sweaters, never spoke during all-hands meetings, and practically lived in the windowless server basement. Nobody in the executive leadership tier ever paid any attention to him. But he was standing there now, holding his heavily encrypted security tablet, and he did not look intimidated in the slightest. He had been formally summoned. My 8:55 morning email, which had explicitly copied the Legal Operations Group inbox, contained enough specific compliance jargon to automatically trigger a mandatory, blind internal security review protocol. Reese adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked directly at Grant, completely ignoring the unspoken corporate hierarchy that usually terrified the technical staff into silence. Legal Operations requested that I pull the deep access history for Ella's account, Reese said, his voice entirely monotone and unimpressed by the corner office surroundings. I actually flagged this specific executive access anomaly last Wednesday. I sent an automated, high-priority security alert regarding the irregular permissions expansion. Reese paused for a brief moment, looking down at his bright screen before delivering the absolute final blow. My direct supervisor explicitly instructed me to permanently close the ticket and I quote, not to make a big deal out of it, per your direct, written orders. Grant's eyes darted wildly around the room, frantically searching for an exit that did not exist. The walls were rapidly closing in on him. He finally realized he was no longer just dealing with a disgruntled manager complaining about long hours. He was standing in the middle of a heavily documented, undeniable conspiracy. "This is completely absurd," Grant stammered, his voice cracking violently. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at Reese. "Revoke her system access immediately. Suspend all of her accounts right now. This is a massive, hostile security breach. She is actively stealing confidential company property. You cannot lock a door that has already been blown wide open," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through his rising panic. 5 minutes before I walked into the morning briefing, a highly detailed, legally protected whistleblower memorandum was successfully transmitted to the Audit Committee hotline. A duplicate, physical copy was sent directly to the independent diligence review firm managing our upcoming capital injection. The door, which Reese had left slightly ajar, opened wider. The human resources business partner, who had been sitting paralyzed in the glass boardroom just moments ago, stepped tentatively into the office. She looked entirely terrified, clutching a yellow legal pad tightly to her chest. I turned my body away from Grant and faced her directly. I pulled a third, sealed envelope from my bag, and held it out. She took it with shaking hands. "I need you to officially document the exact time of this meeting in my permanent file," I told her, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "This envelope contains my formal submission of evidence regarding the unauthorized and fraudulent use of my digital signature by executive leadership. I am establishing this timeline right now to legally protect myself. If there is any retaliatory termination, sudden role reduction, or disciplinary action taken against me after this exact minute, the timeline of cause and effect will be completely undeniable." The dynamic in the room fundamentally fractured and permanently rebuilt itself. This was no longer a private disciplinary meeting where a powerful boss bullied a subordinate into submission. I had successfully dragged the entire hidden executive structure into the blinding light. Legal, human resources, security, and finance were now permanently and hopelessly entangled in a massive, official risk event. Grant slowly lowered his body into his expensive leather executive chair. The arrogant, untouchable chief operating officer from Friday morning was entirely gone. He stared at me across the desk, his eyes wide with a brand new, profound realization. He finally understood that he was not fighting a rebellious employee. He was actively bleeding out against someone who knew the exact rules of the game, who knew precisely which files needed to go to which regulatory bodies, and who possessed the cold, calculated patience to make the absolute truth fiercely protect itself. By exactly 12 o'clock in the afternoon, the shockwave from the morning collision had completely breached the executive floor and violently struck the board of directors. The audit chair, having received the securely transmitted whistleblower memorandum, immediately mandated a sweeping, emergency internal review. The vital executive confirmation of post-restructure stability, the exact document intended to appease our external lenders, was officially and indefinitely suspended. The corporate engine had been thrown entirely into reverse. The people who were supposed to be permanently silenced by their sudden terminations suddenly found their voices. My personal phone, resting quietly on my desk, began to buzz relentlessly. The first message came from Marisol. She forwarded an entire chain of frantic text messages sent directly from Grant's personal cell phone number over the weekend. The audacity of his request was staggering. He had actually asked Marisol, a woman he had coldly fired on Friday morning, to just keep a close eye on her top enterprise accounts and quietly answer their urgent emails for another 2 weeks. He offered her absolutely no formal consulting contract. He provided zero liability insurance to cover her interactions with massive clients. He completely failed to mention any clear parameters for financial compensation. It was a blatant, highly illegal demand for free, off-the-books labor from a terminated employee, purely designed to hide the massive operational gap his cuts had created. 15 minutes later, Owen dropped a massive, heavily encrypted folder into our secure private group chat. He did not write a long explanation. He simply provided the raw ammunition. The folder contained explicit email directives from upper management. The messages ordered Owen to manually downgrade the severity codes of 4 massive back-end database crashes that had occurred over the last quarter. They forced our lead engineer to label catastrophic system failures as low-priority maintenance glitches right before a critical operational review with the lending firm. It was undeniable proof of systemic data manipulation. Lydia's contribution arrived next, and it was the most legally damning piece of evidence yet. She sent a high-resolution scanned copy of a heavily altered compliance summary that Grant had personally handed her exactly 14 days prior. The physical printout was covered in red ink. Grant had manually crossed out critical risk disclosures and heavily edited the mandatory federal reporting language. In her attached message, Lydia noted that she had explicitly and verbally refused to sign the falsified document in his office. Exactly 3 days after that specific refusal, her name mysteriously appeared on the redundant function list. She was not a victim of a random budget cut. She was surgically eliminated because she refused to commit federal compliance fraud. As the evidence poured into my encrypted drive, a much larger, significantly darker picture began to form. A senior financial analyst, clearly emboldened by the fact that I had not been fired after the morning briefing, quietly forwarded me a highly confidential due diligence report from 3 months ago. This was the exact time our massive company acquisition had suddenly and inexplicably fallen through. The official company line, parroted by Grant at every town hall meeting, had blamed unpredictable market conditions and shifting venture capital priorities. That was a complete fabrication. The due diligence report revealed the terrifying truth. The buying company had walked away because their forensic accountants discovered a massive wave of customer churn. Halcyon was losing enterprise clients at an alarming rate, but Grant had explicitly directed the finance team to hide the departing accounts. He forced them to classify the leaving clients under the highly deceptive category of extended pilot programs. They were intentionally masking severe revenue bleed as active, ongoing engagement. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening snap. The brutal 30% workforce reduction was never a strategic optimization designed to save operational costs. It was a frantic, desperate financial manipulation. Grant was slashing the payroll to artificially inflate our earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. He needed to present a beautiful, highly profitable financial snapshot to secure the new refinancing capital before the board of directors realized the company was actually bleeding to death. He was burning the furniture to make the house look warm from the outside. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the psychological temperature on the open floor had fundamentally changed. The paralyzing, suffocating fear that had gripped everyone at 9 o'clock in the morning had completely dissolved. When the remaining staff saw that I had not been immediately escorted out of the building by corporate security after publicly clashing with the chief operating officer, a silent, invisible dam broke across the entire office. My corporate inbox began to flood. Employees who had spent years keeping their heads down, desperately avoiding office politics, started quietly forwarding me their own hidden receipts. I received forwarded emails containing vague, threatening executive directives, instructing customer success teams to intentionally delay sending contractual penalty notices. I received screenshots of performance dashboards where the data labels had been manually altered by upper management to hide failing delivery metrics. The atmosphere shifted from passive terror to active rebellion. The people sitting at the desks around me finally realized that I was not the danger dragging the department down. The true danger was the suffocating culture of silence that had forced every single one of us to carry the heavy weight of leadership's lies for far too long. They saw a crack in the armor, and they were pouring all of their buried resentments directly into it. I sat rigidly at my desk, watching the mountain of undeniable proof grow exponentially with every passing minute. But instead of feeling a rushing sense of victory or vindication, a cold, heavy knot tightened painfully in my stomach. I understood the fragile, explosive psychology of a cornered animal. This was not the end of the war. This was the absolute most dangerous moment of the entire ordeal. The truth was now fully out, sprinting freely through the company network, completely outside of Grant's control. I knew that the executive faction had only two possible paths left to take. They would either collapse entirely under the sheer crushing weight of the accumulated evidence, or they would launch a massive, vicious, and entirely unhinged counterattack. When people like Grant realize they are losing control of the narrative, they do not gracefully surrender. They double down. They would try to spin this entire quiet rebellion into a targeted, malicious conspiracy. They would desperately hunt for one single person to bear the total weight of the destruction, someone they could legally annihilate to save themselves. And as I stared at the hundreds of emails flooding my screen, I knew exactly whose name was firmly written at the absolute top of their list. At precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a mandatory calendar notification forcefully seized control of every single computer monitor across the department. Grant had officially launched his counterattack. The notification commanded every remaining employee to immediately gather in the main corporate auditorium for an emergency all-hands briefing. I closed my laptop, joined the silent, nervous stream of my colleagues, and took a seat in the middle of the large, amphitheater-style room. The air inside the auditorium was incredibly thick, heavy with the suffocating, static tension of a rapidly approaching storm. Grant stood dead center on the brightly lit stage. He wore a freshly pressed suit jacket and held a wireless microphone with practiced, casual ease. He looked surprisingly composed, entirely masking the sheer, unadulterated panic I had witnessed in his private office just a few hours prior. He was attempting to perform a live psychological reset on the entire department. His goal was simple and ruthless. He needed to permanently brand me as a chaotic, emotional, and rebellious liability before the board of directors could officially intercept the narrative. Team, I know today has been an incredibly challenging day for everyone, Grant began, his voice echoing through the massive overhead speakers with a perfectly engineered, empathetic cadence. We are currently navigating a very difficult transition phase. Structural growth requires hard, painful choices, and sometimes those choices create temporary friction. Unfortunately, during times of high stress, a few individuals can handle the pressure quite unprofessionally. He did not look directly at me, but the implication hung heavy and deliberate in the quiet room. He slowly paced the length of the stage, gesturing smoothly with his free hand. It has recently come to my attention that certain internal data points have been extracted entirely out of context today, Grant continued, his tone shifting from empathetic to subtly threatening. There is a false, highly destructive narrative being aggressively pushed by someone who is actively resisting our necessary operational changes. Let me be perfectly clear with all of you. Creating a manufactured crisis to force this company to bend to your personal demands is not leadership, it is sabotage. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. He was trying to weave a story where I was the villain, a disgruntled employee throwing a massive tantrum and holding the company hostage simply to save my own job. He calculated that the sheer, imposing weight of his executive title would effortlessly crush the brewing rebellion and force everyone back into their compliant, terrified silence. But Grant fundamentally miscalculated the brand new reality of the room. When the paralyzing fear of being fired finally breaks, human beings will choose to speak the truth far faster than they will choose to remain silent. From the middle of the third row, a senior project manager named Marcus abruptly stood up. He did not raise his hand. He did not wait for a microphone to be passed to him by a coordinator. He simply projected his voice across the quiet auditorium, completely shattering the carefully controlled atmosphere. If the internal data is being taken out of context, Grant, could you please explain the severity alerts from last month? Marcus asked, his voice steady and remarkably loud. Why were we explicitly ordered by your office to artificially downgrade the priority levels on 4 massive database crashes, especially when those specific clients were actively demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in financial credit for the downtime? Grant faltered physically. His smooth, confident pacing came to an immediate, jarring halt. He gripped the microphone tightly. Marcus, this all-hands briefing is absolutely not the appropriate forum to discuss highly specific, isolated technical glitches. Grant deflected, his voice tightening with visible irritation. Those were complex operational decisions made with full executive context. Actually, the context is quite simple. A voice echoed clearly from the back of the auditorium. Every head in the room turned. It was Reese Calder. The notoriously quiet systems security specialist was standing directly behind the main audiovisual control desk. He did not yell, and he did not hold a microphone. He simply reached forward and tapped a single, heavy keystroke on his connected laptop. The massive, high-definition projector screen directly behind Grant instantly illuminated, casting a blinding, harsh white light over the entire stage. It displayed a gigantic screenshot of the raw system log. There, blown up to 10 feet tall for 200 people to witness, was the exact digital footprint of the severity override. The authorizing user identification clearly spelled out Grant Mercer, accompanied by an irrefutable timestamp from 3 weeks ago. The room erupted in a low, collective murmur of absolute shock. Grant spun around to look at the towering screen, the remaining color completely draining from his face. He had literally been caught red-handed, his own digital signature betraying his lies in real time. Before Grant could even attempt to formulate a desperate excuse, the human resources business partner stood up from her seat in the front row. She was no longer clutching her yellow legal pad defensively against her chest. She held it open, reading directly from the official corporate record. For the official documentation of this meeting, she stated clearly, her voice echoing into the microphone positioned near the stage. The formal layoff documentation submitted to my office yesterday classified this morning's workforce reduction as a strictly non-client impacting restructuring. However, the operational transition plan you mandated this morning demanded that one single manager absorb the direct, active management of our 20 largest enterprise accounts and all federal compliance reporting. Those two statements fundamentally contradict each other and expose this company to massive legal liability. The walls of the auditorium were rapidly closing in on the chief operating officer. His carefully planned public relations spin had instantly mutated into a vicious, unyielding public cross-examination. Then, the final, heaviest blow landed. Dana Heller, the chief financial officer, stood up. She had been sitting quietly in the back corner, observing the entire spectacular collapse. When she spoke, the entire auditorium fell completely, entirely dead silent. Her voice carried the lethal, absolute authority of the company's highest financial officer. "Grant," Dana said, her tone dropping to absolute zero. She stared daggers directly at the man on the stage. "I want you to answer me right now, in front of this entire department. Exactly how many material risk disclosures have you actively withheld from the finance and legal departments in the past 90 days? Grant was completely, hopelessly trapped. He was standing on a brightly lit stage, surrounded by gigantic, irrefutable proof, being interrogated by his own executive peer, his polished persona entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated panic. He completely abandoned his subtle implications and pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at me in the audience. "She stole that data," Grant screamed, his voice cracking violently over the public address system, completely losing control of his emotions. "Ella Crawford is actively committing corporate espionage. She illegally breached secure executive files to steal proprietary company information. Security needs to escort her off the premises this exact second." The entire auditorium shifted their gaze to me. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic yelling. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap, looking directly at the man having a public meltdown on stage. "I did not steal a single thing, Grant," I replied, ensuring my voice was perfectly steady, calm, and utterly rational, providing the ultimate contrast to his hysterical screaming. "Every single document, system log, and compliance report I accessed falls strictly within my mandated administrative purview as the Senior Service Operations Manager according to the company policy. Furthermore, the sensitive financial documents were not distributed publicly. They were submitted directly and securely to the Board of Directors Audit Committee hotline, perfectly in accordance with the protected whistleblower protocols outlined in our own employee handbook." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The giant projector screen continued to cast its harsh, bright light over Grant's rigid, sweating figure. The all-hands meeting, strategically designed to reassert his total dominance, had become a spectacular, unmitigated disaster. It was no longer a corporate update intended to reassure the staff. It had devolved into a live, public confession, where every single time Grant opened his mouth to defend himself, he inadvertently dug his professional grave significantly deeper. He had tried to build a firing squad, completely unaware that he was the only one standing against the wall. By 5:30 in the afternoon, the executive wing felt less like a corporate office and more like a crisis room. The explosive fallout from the all-hands meeting had entirely stripped Grant of his usual theatrical control. An emergency, closed-door session was officially scheduled for 6 o'clock in the main boardroom. This was not a standard quarterly review. The attendee list included the senior members of the board of directors, the primary representative from our external lending firm, and a senior partner from the outside legal counsel representing the investors. Grant was no longer the director of the play. He was the subject of an active inquisition. 10 minutes before the meeting was set to begin, Grant intercepted me in the narrow corridor leading to the executive kitchen. He looked physically diminished. His tailored suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, and the arrogant, untouchable aura he usually projected had completely evaporated. But cornered men are often the most manipulative, and he still had one final, desperate card to play before the heavy doors closed. "Listen to me," Grant said, keeping his voice to an urgent, hushed whisper as he glanced nervously down the empty hallway. "We can still fix this before we walk into that room. I am prepared to authorize an immediate $50,000 retention bonus. wired directly to your account by tomorrow morning. I will bump your title to Vice President of Global Operations, effective immediately. I will give you complete, special authority over your entire department budget. You can hire back anyone you want. All you have to do is sit at that table and tell the board that the internal communications were simply a temporary misunderstanding during a highly stressful transition period. He was attempting to buy my silence with the exact corporate currency he valued above all else, money and a shiny title. But it was his next sentence that truly revealed the absolute darkness at the core of his leadership. He leaned slightly closer, attempting to forge a false sense of camaraderie. I chose you to carry it all because you are the strongest one here. Ella, I knew you could shoulder the weight. It was supposed to sound like a compliment. It was designed to flatter my ego, to make me feel uniquely capable and indispensable. Instead, it was the coldest, most revealing statement he had ever made. In that single sentence, Grant exposed his entire worldview. To him, my dedication, my competence, and my sheer endurance were not traits to be respected or rewarded. They were simply natural resources to be aggressively mined and exploited until they were completely depleted. My strength was just a tool he used to build his own safety net. I looked at him, feeling absolutely no desire to gloat or celebrate his desperation. Grant, I do not want your title, and I am not going to lie for you, I replied evenly, my voice devoid of any anger. If the board of directors actually wants to discuss a viable solution in this meeting, they need to start by immediately releasing the unpaid severance packages for the staff you terminated on Friday. They need to authorize the immediate payout of all suspended quarterly bonuses, and they need to issue a formal written mandate permanently ending all off-book directives demanding free labor from former employees. Until that happens, there is no conversation to be had. I walked past him and entered the boardroom. The atmosphere inside the room was suffocatingly dense. The heavy hitters were all present, either physically seated around the massive oak table or dialed in via the high-definition secure video screens lining the wall. Grant took a seat near the corner, his eyes fixed firmly on his closed notebook. He was entirely silent. Richard, one of the most senior board members, cleared his throat and attempted to take control of the narrative. He was a man who specialized in damage control, smoothly smoothing over rough edges to protect the share price. Let us take a deep breath and look at this objectively, Richard began, folding his hands resting on the table. We are clearly dealing with a severe case of miscommunication under pressure. Restructuring a company is always a highly emotional process. Wires get crossed, and operational friction is natural. We just need to realign our internal messaging and assure our partners that the core business remains fundamentally sound. He was trying to sweep a massive corporate fraud under the rug of emotional stress. I did not raise my hand to interject. I simply opened my leather binder and laid the timeline out flat on the table. This is not a matter of emotional friction or crossed wires. Richard, I stated firmly, ensuring every person on the video screens could hear me clearly. This is a documented timeline of material contract breaches and federal compliance fraud. At exactly 12:43 and 1:12 in the morning last week, executive virtual private network credentials were used to forge my digital signature on critical stability disclosures intended for our financial lenders. Furthermore, as of this morning, we are officially in breach of our master service agreements with our top 3 enterprise clients, due to a deliberate failure to notify them of key personnel changes within the mandatory 24-hour window. The outside counsel, a sharp-featured woman appearing on the largest screen, leaned forward immediately. She did not care about corporate feelings. She only cared about legal liability. Ms. Crawford's assessment is entirely correct, the attorney confirmed, her tone completely devoid of sympathy. I reviewed the protected memorandum submitted to the hotline. The failure to disclose the personnel changes, combined with the altered system severity logs, constitutes a severe breach of disclosure protocols. If these documents were presented to the lenders as factual, we are looking at active financial misrepresentation. The lender representative, sitting on the adjacent screen, did not hesitate. His firm was poised to inject millions of dollars into our company, and he had just been informed that the foundation was built on sand. Given the severity of these internal findings and the active legal exposure, the lender representative announced, his voice echoing coldly through the room, my firm is officially freezing the entire refinancing process effective immediately. We will not proceed with any capital transfer until a fully independent, third-party forensic review of your entire operational and compliance structure is complete. The room seemed to violently decompress. The lifeline the board had been desperately counting on was just cleanly severed, just as the silence settled heavily over the table. Dana Heller's phone buzzed loudly against the wood. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the new email. Her face turned completely ashen. She looked up at the board members. I just received a formal notification from the legal department of our largest enterprise client, Dana said, her voice shaking slightly. They have officially issued a 10-day cure notice. If we cannot present a comprehensive, credible recovery plan and restore the mandated operational staffing levels within 10 days, they are terminating their contract without penalty, and they are taking their entire portfolio with them. The company was not just wounded, it was actively bleeding out on the table. They had exactly 10 days to perform a miracle, or the most lucrative accounts would vanish, taking the entire valuation of the company down with them. They needed a flawless operational strategy, and more importantly, they needed a leader who still possessed a shred of credibility with the clients and the internal staff. Grant was legally and professionally radioactive. Nobody would ever trust a word he said again. Slowly, one by one, every single pair of eyes in the boardroom turned to look directly at me. It was a moment of profound, painful irony. The board of directors suddenly realized that the quiet, overworked middle manager they had allowed Grant to brutally exploit was now the absolute only person in the building who truly understood the complex systems, retained the trust of the clients, and possessed the hard data needed to stop the bleeding. They needed me to step up, take the reins, and miraculously save the company from the exact disaster they had negligently allowed to happen. I looked back at the ring of desperate executives and silent video screens. I saw the quiet pleading in their eyes. They were completely ready to offer me anything I wanted, but as I sat there, observing the wreckage of their own arrogant decisions, I felt absolutely no desire to be their savior. That was the most devastating blow I could possibly deliver to the board. They desperately needed a human shield to protect their burning building, but they were staring at a person who had finally, unequivocally decided to let it burn. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the ventilation system. The executives stared at me, waiting for me to accept the crushing burden they had so carelessly created. Even as the walls of his own making collapsed entirely around him, Grant simply could not help himself. He was completely incapable of acknowledging defeat. He leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his tie with a trembling hand, and attempted to summon his commanding executive voice one last time. "Well, Ella, this is exactly why you are in leadership," Grant said, his tone dripping with a desperate, artificial authority. "We clearly have some severe operational gaps, but we need you to take full ownership of this crisis. You need to spearhead the recovery plan and guide the remaining team through the turbulence. We can sort out the administrative misunderstandings later, but right now, the company needs you to step up and fix this." He was still trying to hand me the mop to clean up his disaster. He genuinely believed that if he used enough corporate buzzwords, I would reflexively fall back into line and do the exhausting work of saving his career. I looked at him with a profound sense of pity. Then, I turned my attention back to the senior board members and the outside legal counsel displayed on the video screens. I was ready to play the absolute final card, a strategic asset I had kept entirely hidden since the beginning of the chaos. "I am not going to spearhead anything for Grant," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the long oak table. "However, I do have a recovery plan. 6 weeks ago, my team and I recognized a highly concerning shift in the operational directives coming from the executive suite. We anticipated a catastrophic structural failure. In response, Marisol, Owen, Lydia, and I spent our own personal time quietly building a comprehensive contingency playbook. Grant's eyes widened in sudden horror. He opened his mouth to object, but the outside counsel raised a hand on the video screen, silencing him instantly. This playbook, I continued, contains every single client dependency, the absolute minimum operational workflows required to maintain our service-level agreements, the exact fracture points of our back-end systems, and the precise technical recovery sequences needed to keep the enterprise accounts online. It is the only existing roadmap that can actually save the contracts we just breached. The board chair leaned forward, a glimmer of desperate hope flashing across his face. Where is this document? We need it deployed to the surviving engineering teams immediately. It is not on any Halcyon server, I replied coldly. It is not on my company laptop, and it is not in any internal archive where executive leadership can manually alter the data to hide their tracks. Yesterday evening, I transferred the entire encrypted playbook directly to the outside legal counsel representing the lending firm. I submitted it as a formally preserved evidentiary asset. The senior partner on the video screen nodded slowly, verifying my statement to the terrified board of directors. I had completely removed the company's survival guide from their physical control. The playbook is legally locked, I explained, watching the reality crash over the executives in real time. I have stipulated that it can only be released and utilized under two specific, non-negotiable conditions. Condition 1 requires the immediate, fully transparent rehiring of Marisol, Owen, and Lydia, with full back pay and formal guarantees against retaliatory termination. Condition 2, should they choose not to return, requires the company to immediately and unconditionally release my entire former team from all non-compete clauses and legal threats, allowing us to walk away cleanly. The board instantly understood the brutal, undeniable truth of the situation. Their optimization strategy was dead. The only remaining path to keep the company alive was to completely reverse the disastrous personnel cuts and ruthlessly eliminate the man who had pushed them to the absolute brink of destruction. Dana Heller, the chief financial officer, did not hesitate for a single second. She looked directly at the audit chair sitting across the table. They exchanged a brief, silent nod of complete agreement. Dana turned her chair to face Grant. "Grant Mercer," Dana said, her voice landing like a gavel. "Effective immediately, you are placed on mandatory administrative leave, pending a comprehensive, independent forensic review of your entire department. This review will cover every single compliance disclosure, every altered system log, and every instance of forged digital authorizations. You are to hand over your company phone and your security badge right now. Corporate security will escort you out of the building." Grant sat completely frozen. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking hollow and incredibly small. He tried to stammer out a defense, to spin one final lie, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the room, searching for a single ally, but he found absolutely nothing but cold, furious glares. He slowly reached into his pocket, placed his badge on the wood surface, and walked out of the boardroom in total silence. With the architect of the disaster officially removed, the board of directors immediately turned their collective desperation back toward me. The board chair offered a warm, incredibly placating smile. "Ella, you have demonstrated extraordinary operational awareness," he said smoothly. "We want to formally offer you the position of Executive Vice President of Operations. We will double your current salary. You will have a massive retention bonus, real executive power, and the absolute authority to handpick your own recovery team. You can build the department exactly the way you want it." It was a phenomenal offer. If they had presented me with that exact package a year ago, I would have accepted it without a second thought. I would have dedicated my life to fixing their broken machines. But standing in that room, looking at the people who had blindly allowed a toxic, manipulative leader to destroy the livelihoods of my friends simply to boost a quarterly profit margin, I felt completely detached. "No," I said softly, but with absolute, unbreakable finality. The board chair blinked, genuinely shocked. Ella, this is a massive opportunity to change the culture from the top down. I am not going to spend the best years of my professional life trying to prove that an inherently exploitative environment can suddenly become decent just because you desperately need someone to hold the fire extinguisher, I replied, closing my leather binder. You do not want a leader. You want someone to clean up a mess you created. I decline the offer, and I am officially submitting my resignation. Effective right now. I did not wait for their counteroffer. I turned around and walked out of the glass boardroom, leaving the executives sitting in the suffocating silence of their own making. Over the next several weeks, the fallout was incredibly swift and completely unsentimental. Halcyon failed to meet the demands of the cure notice. Two of our largest enterprise clients formally terminated their massive contracts. However, those clients did not just walk away. They reached out directly to Marisol. They knew exactly who actually did the heavy lifting. They offered to fully fund a brand new, independent operational management studio if she could assemble the right team. Within a month, Marisol, Owen, Lydia, and I co-founded our own firm. We leased a bright, open office space on the other side of Denver. We explicitly banned the phrase "we are a family" from all of our corporate literature. We built a company based entirely on clear, documented processes, realistic client expectations, strictly enforced working hours, and genuine, professional respect. Slowly but surely, the best remaining talent from Halcyon began to quietly migrate over to our new studio. They did not come to join a dramatic revenge fantasy. They came because, for the very first time in their careers, they saw a working model where extreme technical competence did not automatically translate into being squeezed completely dry by greedy management. Several months later, I read a small, buried article in a local business journal. Halcyon Rote Systems had been quietly sold off for parts in a highly depressed, incredibly sad corporate acquisition. There was no explosive movie ending, no dramatic courtroom scenes, and no screaming matches in the rain. Just a quiet, pathetic whimper of a failing company fading into total obscurity. Standing in my new office, looking at a project schedule that actually respected the human capacity of my team, I realized the ultimate truth about professional warfare. The strongest, most devastating form of revenge is not destroying a terrible boss. The most powerful revenge is simply building a reality where men like Grant Mercer no longer have a place to hide, and where their desperate, toxic exploitation can never again be disguised as actual leadership. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below to share your thoughts and connect with everyone. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories. Hit the like button on this video, and do not forget to turn on notifications so this story can reach and empower even more people.